All right, welcome in everyone to Cover One Buffalo. Nate Geary here. Without Aaron Quinn, which is a little weird, which is too bad because I wore all my special gear for Aaron because he's a Michigan fan, and it's too bad that he couldn't be here to enjoy this with me. But joining me instead is Michael Crawford. Mike, thanks for joining us here on Cover One Buffalo, man. We appreciate it.
Hey, Nate, I really appreciate you guys having me on. Big fan of all the stuff that you guys do over there at Cover One. So it's really cool to be here.
So tell all the folks where they can find you on Twitter, some of your work as well, breaking down the Ravens.
Okay, you can find me on Twitter at Abukari. That's Abukari. And I do some stuff for a couple different local sites. Russell Street Report is one that I've done a few pieces for. Just over this summer, I agreed to kind of do some film analysis for purplerain.com. So I actually haven't dropped anything over there yet, but I'm looking forward to kicking off the season and doing some work over there.
Awesome, man. Well, before we dive into this, opponent research, I guess, this opposition research, I want to remind the folks that unfortunately, if you didn't take advantage of Cover One and Eric's deal, this $10 for his premium content, it is back up to our normal price of a one-time fee of $25 or $5 a month. So you could still get it at a great deal, but not the piping hot deal. You could get it that Eric was giving it to folks for a majority of the summer training camp, right into the preseason. So that is over, that trial run. But as I mentioned, it's definitely worth the $5 or the $25 fee that you'll be spending to get premium content from podcasts from Aaron and myself, obviously, but from all the guys that are just pumping out weekly and really, quite honestly, daily and hourly content up at cover1.net. But if you've got the premium content, you already know that's coming. So I just wanted to thank all the folks that are going to be in the chat tonight, specifically Aaron Quinn, who couldn't be with us, who's already talking smack about my Notre Dame gear, but that's okay because the win column is all that matters. Mike, let's hop in to the Ravens a little bit here. Obviously, this is a really interesting matchup. This is like what, 2 out of 3 are going to meet in week 1 in Baltimore. Tell us a little bit. Let's start first offensively, and let's start, I think, with the most important thing that everyone wants to know is what is going on with Joe Flacco. Is he going to return to the form of, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago Joe Flacco, or is the Joe Flacco we've seen as the 32nd ranked passer going to be the guy here that we see not only week 1, but until he's eventually pulled for the guy that they drafted in the first round, put assets into, and Lamar Jackson?
Well, the hope here is that we don't see that guy, the latter guy that you just described, the guy that we saw last year for the last couple of years. And by all accounts, obviously he didn't play very much in the preseason, but from all accounts from the beat writers who've covered, camp and all the camp practices, take it for what it's worth. But they say that, this is the best that he's looked.
But how many times, I feel like that is something that I've heard about guys like Flacco. Other than last year, because I think last year was really difficult for Flacco coming into the season, really not having any training camp because of that back injury, missing all of the preseason, and really kind of coming into week 1, week 2 as just expected to sort of come in and play. And you could tell that there was rust there.
Yeah. The injury, I think, was a bigger factor than maybe we, even the fan base, realized. A back injury probably should have been something that we all kind of anticipated was going to really affect his play, but I don't know that people did. And, obviously, you don't want to attribute everything to injury, but it's kind of hard to ignore the change from the first half of the season to the second half of the season, where they ended up finishing 9th in points scored, in terms of offense. Right. And obviously it wasn't just Flacco. Alex Collins was a huge part of that with the running game. But he just looked a lot sharper. Ball came out quicker. There's more accuracy. So I think as he got healthier, as the running game started to really gel and the offensive line situation became more consistent, you really saw an improvement on offense. So yeah, I hope. I get what you're saying. I totally get it. We're talking about training camp and preseason. And yeah, okay, great, right? It's great to hear. A guy looks great. Right. Awesome. Awesome. But until, we're in real live game action, none of that matters. So I'm cautiously optimistic. Obviously they've done some things in terms of changing their wide receiver room on offense that I think could really help him a lot more too. We can get into that if you want, but I expect Flacco, and this just I guess a little bit of hope, but then also a little bit of carryover from the end of last year. I expect him to play well this year and to start out, hopefully fast in this first game.
So before we dive into some of the help that definitely came over this year, and Willie Snead is a guy that somebody in the chat brought up that you almost sort of forget about because of the season or the down season he had due to which was a lot of injuries in New Orleans last year. A guy like John Brown, a guy with a lot of speed that can maybe open things up for Flacco to use what he really has been known for, and that's that deep ball over the beginning course of his career. And then obviously Michael Crabtree, as you mentioned, and really maybe the idea that they moved on from Peterman, a mistake that, it was really difficult for that organization, I'm sure, to move on from, using a high first round pick on a player and really sort of wanting him to overcome a lot of injury issues that he had. But I want to, before we get into that, talk a little bit about the backup quarterbacks, because I think as much as everybody wants to talk about Lamar Jackson and, when is it going to be his time to take over, I don't think a lot of people have given enough credit to RG3, to Robert Griffin, a guy that has really, in my opinion, resurrected his career into, listen, I mean, he's not coming in here and he's not pushing Joe Flacco, in my opinion, to be the starter, but he's shown really from that Hall of Fame game throughout the preseason that he has some of that confidence back that I think he really lacked when he spent a couple games in Cleveland, and then obviously at the tail end of his career in Washington, where things just really did work out for him. Talk a little bit about what you saw from RG3 and maybe your level of surprise of what you saw from him this preseason.
I think surprise is the perfect word for it, because everything that you just mentioned, right? The little bit of time that he spent with Cleveland and then the bulk of the season being out of football, I really didn't know what to expect. When they brought him in and they worked him out, when you're talking about a backup quarterback, obviously in comparison to Ryan Mallett, who they had for the last couple of years, you're thinking, all right, I know RG3's kind of hit the skids recently, but he's got to be better than Mallett, right? But I think that was borne out on the field. Again, we're talking about practice and preseason, but I think everything that he's shown is a guy that came in, still obviously has arm talent. He always had that. Obviously he's not probably the same level guy that he was in terms of a runner, even though he looks pretty fast to me. Matter of fact, I think he made a comment during one of the press conferences that in a straight line race, he thinks he's faster than Lamar. Like Lamar's shiftier and, has a little bit more of the juke in his game, but he feels like he's still, of course he's going to say that, right? He's
right.
But no, I think what you saw in the games is you saw a guy who throws the ball accurately still. I think that was always something that he did pretty well, particularly throws an accurate deep ball. Came in, seems to have picked up the offense relatively well. And I'm confident in his ability to step in if Flacco were to get hurt or, God forbid, or anything like that. And to be able to win a game or two, or, hopefully it's no more than that.
And the other thing too, that I think is maybe underrated or not talked about maybe why we're seeing a resurgence from RG3 is Marty Morningwig. Like he really has a way of developing and getting the most out of, athletic, raw type quarterbacks. I mean, Michael Vick is a guy that sticks out to me, having his resurgence towards the end of his career with the Eagles with Marty Morningwig. And then now you're seeing it with maybe there's not a better guy in the league to have a guy like Lamar Jackson and or RG3. And maybe that's why you're seeing some of the early success that we had from RG3.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think you're right. I think it's something that maybe gets overlooked a little bit or glossed over a little bit, is that Marty and Greg Roman,
good point.
Both have worked with athletic quarterbacks. When you talk about Vic, when you talk about even a little bit of Donovan McNabb, because they had that year where they were kind of, mixing Vic back into that package when Donovan was still the starter. And then, of course, Kaepernick with Roman out in San Francisco. So you've got guys who have a lot of experience with sort of this dual threat quarterback. And I think one of the things that's really exciting to me is that part of the playbook that really played to those guys' strengths to be able to be that dual threat kind of guy. That kind of was just something they weren't accessing with Flacco, right? Sure. But it's there, and it didn't go away.
Right.
So now there's another part of the playbook that maybe you can access with these guys, and I fully expect them to run some packages for Lamar. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw him in every game. You know what I mean? With some sort of package.
And I think Sean McDermott, Bill's head coach, and their defensive coordinator Leslie Frazier both sort of feel the same way you do, because it was in the news this week or in his press conference talking a lot about them wanting to prepare properly for the idea that Lamar Jackson might get a few plays in this game or might have a package, whether it's a wildcat type package, whether it's more of him lining up in the backfield as a running back or even as a wide receiver, that the Bills are preparing for something like that. So that's definitely something I think not only the Bills, but I think the rest of the league are sort of preparing for as the season opens when they're going to be facing a team like the Ravens. I'm interested in your thoughts, though, before we get into the wide receiver position, which is a lot different than maybe what that Bills fans might remember the last 2 or 3 years of the Ravens being, is this backfield. Because how important was the emergence of Alex Collins last year towards the end of the season, where he clearly separated himself from a group of running backs who are all kind of do their own thing pretty well to a certain extent in Buck Allen. And I'm forgetting the other name. Who was the other guy?
Terrence West and Danny Woodhead.
That's right. And Danny Woodhead. You forget about that as well. So, yeah, I mean, talk a little bit about obviously the guys that are behind Alex Collins, but how important the development of Collins has been into RB1 and sort of how this might propel that offense to a level that maybe they haven't been in a few years.
It was so key. I mean, it really was. It was really key to that. You know, I mentioned earlier how they finished 9th in points scored. I think it really was a critical factor to that turnaround on offense, in addition to Flacco getting healthy in the offensive line. But I mean, just think about the circumstances, right? He's
right.
waived by Seattle, right? Going into the beginning of the season. And how often do you pick a guy who's cut during the preseason and becomes your leading rusher? Right. I mean, just the scenario in itself is kind of strange. I mean, almost 1,000 yards, just short of 1,000 yards on, I think, right around 200 carries. I mean, he didn't even play for the first game or two. But what he did was he brought an explosive element to their offense. It's something that they really didn't have. You know, obviously, Terrence West is not that guy. You know, he's a little bit more of a bigger, sort of thicker and in between the tackles kind of guy. Buck Allen, you know, kind of a jack of all trades, master of none kind of guy, good pass catcher out of the backfield, decent runner, but, you know, kind of an all around guy. And then Woodhead, you know, he got hurt in that Bengals game, in that first Bengals game, and missed a bunch of time. Did come back later in the season and was able to kind of offer some things on third down. Great pass protector, a great pass protector. I mean, I had no idea that guy was so good. I mean, everybody kind of knows about him as a receiver out of the backfield and kind of like a hybrid kind of running back slot guy. But this guy was tremendous in pass protection. So they're really going to miss that. But Collins, that bursty, I mean, that's not even a word, but it's like the first thing that comes to mind when I think about his style, kind of explosive, you know, one cut, make guys miss in the open field. And that was, to me, one of the biggest things that he brought to the running game, was an ability to make guys miss, right? You can obviously do things with scheme to create opportunities for running backs, but when he'd be in the hole with a guy unblocked, so many times he was able to make that guy miss just on his own with quickness and lateral agility. So he was a huge asset to the running game. Yeah,
I can tell you he certainly helped my fantasy team at the end of the season having him on the roster. I'll tell you that. Let's talk about these receivers, Mike. Specifically, let's talk about Crabtree, because maybe an underrated, or in some cases maybe an overrated pickup, because I just don't know what is going to be the expectations for Crabtree, knowing that he is definitely on the tail end of his career. I wouldn't say he's going to be bad at this point, because he still has some, I think, productivity left. But in terms of speed and ability to separate, I wonder where he is currently at this point in his career.
Yeah, excuse me. I think what you see with him, and I think what Ravens fans are probably excited about, is a continuation of this trend of signing free agent wide receivers, guys who've been really productive throughout their careers, who maybe, you know, the perception is that they're kind of on the back nine of their careers. And maybe there's a little bit of reality of that too. I mean, this goes back to Derek Mason, Anquan Bolden, Steve Smith, right? But they're able to bring these guys in and get a year or two of relatively high level production out of them. And I think that's probably the thought process with bringing with Crabtree in. I think you're right. I totally agree with you on your assessment in terms of separation ability, in terms of speed and quickness and that kind of thing. I don't think that he's the same guy that he was.
But that's never really been like a big part of his game either. He's never been a burner. He's been a Des Bryant type, a guy that a guy that can be relied upon in the red zone to make plays, jump balls, and go up against other teams' number one corners. But you know, that Talib and Crabtree feud, it always just kind of sticks out to me in my mind. Yeah. Like, he, in a lot of ways, is a lot of teams, and would be a lot of teams' number one or number two wide receiver. But how many teams is he their number one receiver? And I think right now he's their number one receiver.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably definitely is the consensus perception for me, and we can talk about this later if you want. But for me, I actually think John Brown has opportunity to be that guy. But from Crabtree, I think he fits that mold of a guy that really suits Flacco, right? a possession guy, a contested catch guy, a jump ball guy, a target in the red zone. You mentioned all of those things. He's always kind of had that type, right? That prototype at receiver. And I think that fits him well because he's a guy who, when he develops a rapport with a receiver, he will feed that guy, right? Sure. Almost to a detriment, right? When he locks in one guy and he will feed that guy and go back to that guy in clutch situations or critical game situations all the time. So I think that's really a skill set that Crabtree brings. And let's be honest, when he was with the Raiders and the times that they played us, this guy would have like 2 or 3 touchdowns every time he played us. So he killed us every time. Not the Super Bowl, obviously. Didn't go that way back when he was with the 49ers, but in the Raiders games where he's come here. So I think they've always looked for that type of receiver to be a part of their wide receiver group. Who's that possession, contested catch, jump ball, kind of tough, gritty guy in the room, and he's the guy this year, and I'm expecting some big things in the red zone in particular from him.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, a couple of questions we're getting in the chat here, and one of them talking about Ronnie Staley and sort of his development into maybe one of those premier tackles in the league. Talk a little bit about his importance to maybe the rest of this offensive line.
Yeah, particularly you saw it last year, particularly with Yonda going out in that second game against the Bengals and being out for the rest of the season. I mean, he really is, Marshall Yonda really is the rock of that line. I mean, the experienced veteran, and still, I think he's been in the league over 10 years now, but still just one of the best guards out there. But with him being out, then who takes over? Who kind of becomes that rock and kind of, the cornerstone of that offensive line? And I think it was Stanley. And he really is, in my opinion, developing into one of the better young left tackles in the league. Extremely mobile, extremely athletic, has a basketball background from high school. So you see that when you watch him. You see the athletic ability. You see the mobility. I think the area that I want to see some more development in this year is how he anchors. I think you saw that a lot last year. When he would get beat, it would be with bull rush. It would be with speed to power. I think he was decent at handling sort of inside counter moves when guys kind of start out with that outside rush and want to counter back inside because of his mobility and athleticism. But that anchor, you'd literally see him, sometimes get forklifted like back into the pocket. And that's something that, you'd like to see some development. And this is, I think, year 3, either year 3 or year 4 for him.
I think it's year 3. I mean, clearly I'm a fan of Ronnie Staley.
Of course.
And not only am I a fan, but he came from O-Line U, which is Notre Dame, who just seems to every year sort of develop from their freshman year on really high caliber, top level athletic offensive linemen, not just anchors, not just guys that are good run blockers, but guys that sort of have the total package. And I think that Stanley really kind of fits that mold. But in terms of what this offensive line is going to be expected to be this year, would you maybe think of them as a middle of the road offensive line in terms of rankings, maybe in the league, in terms of what they can do versatility wise? And maybe is this an offense that Marty Morningwig's running that is going to maybe fit the skill set of the lineman? Because I know, speaking from experience with the Bills last year, is, they started the season with Rick Dennison running an offense that really just didn't fit the type of lineman they had. So, your thoughts on maybe the fit that this offense will be around what the skill set of this offensive line is.
Excuse me. I think it's a good fit. And I think that part, at least in terms of the running game in particular, has a whole lot more to do with Greg Roman than it does with Marty Morningwig, because he is by title the run game coordinator. But I think when you listen to the beat guys kind of talk about it, he pretty much is the guy who's redesigned and reinvented this run game, right? Going back to last year, because if you go back 2 years ago, they were really bad in the run game. I think they actually, in 2016, I think they attempted the most passes in the league because they simply couldn't run the ball. They just weren't very good at it. So I think they kind of got caught in that transition from going from that Kubiak-Dennison zone scheme, and they drafted offensive linemen to fit that, kind of your lighter, more mobile guys. And then Roman comes in, and he's more of a power. I mean, obviously they still run zone under
plug and pull, a lot of plug and pull, but he's going to be more of you need more athletic offensive linemen if you're going to run what Greg Roman wants you to run, especially just guys in the middle in the interior of that offensive line, having not only the ability to pull, but pull and get downfield. Like this isn't just pull and get to the A gap. This is pull from your center pulling and your right guard pulling and getting all the way out to the outside and really giving yourself lead blockers on counters and trays and things like that.
Yeah. And I think that they have the guys, particularly the guard spots that you mentioned. We'll talk about the center a little bit, but I think particularly at the guard spot, they have the guys that really fit that mold. Obviously, Yonder can do that. I mean, Yonder can do anything. There's no scheme that guy can't excel in. And then Alex Lewis. Alex Lewis is a guy who they drafted as a tackle a couple of years back out of Nebraska and has played guard for them, played tackle a little bit early in his rookie year, but he's dealt with injuries. But they really think that he has a better fit at guard. So at least with the initial depth chart that they released, he's going to be the starting left guard. And he's another guy that's really mobile, really athletic, really can get out and move. So when you've got two guys like that at the guard positions who can move, I think you're right. That really fits what they want to do. And then he uses his tight ends a ton. Nick Boyle, Max Williams, not guys that are going to be huge pass catchers, and they're certainly not guys that are like seam rippers or anything like that. But he will run so many 12 personnel, one running back, two tight end sets, and use those guys as pullers. And it is so he'll pull a lineman and pull one of those guys to kind of get that, two pullers on the front side action going on. So they definitely like to use that package, and they've got the kind of guy. And Nick Boyle, this guy's like 280 pounds at the time.
It's a big boy. Yeah,
he's a big boy. He's a big boy. So I think they, in terms of fit, just kind of going back to your initial question about fit, I think they really do have the guys to fit what they want to do.
So let's go to the side of the ball where it seems like everybody in the chat really wants to talk about, and that's the defensive side of the ball. And maybe more so, I think a lot of Bills fans are interested in, how can this Bills offense attack this Ravens defense? And I think the first guy that really sticks out to me, or maybe him not being there sticks out to me, is Jimmy Smith.
Yeah.
And not only Jimmy Smith, because we know what this Ravens pass defense is when he's in the game. When he's not, the numbers reflect that very much so. So your thoughts about the absence of Jimmy Smith early in the season, and maybe who Bills fans can expect to see that maybe aren't familiar with some of the other corners on the roster.
Yeah, you it sounds like you've looked at those numbers, and it's significant. The difference with Jimmy in the lineup versus when he's out of the lineup, it is a significant difference. And not just in terms of pass yards, just across the board on defense, points allowed, yardage allowed, even run. It seems to have this overarching effect on them. But I think the thing this year that maybe can set up to be a little bit different from previous years is the depth that they have at the cornerback position. They didn't always have that in previous years when he would go out due to injury, and in this case, suspension this year. So you have last year's first round pick out Alabama, Marlon Humphrey, who I really liked what they did with him last year in terms of easing him into a role, right? They didn't just automatically plop him into a starting role. They kept Brandon Carr opposite Jimmy Smith. Brandon Carr, veteran, been around, been in Dallas and some other places. Solid guy, right? I mean, I think some people might remember, I remember it was either a Thursday or Monday night game late in the season against Pittsburgh, and Antonio Brown lit him up for a couple long balls. So that kind of sticks out in people's mind about Brandon Carr. But if you look at the overall season, had about 3 or 4 picks, I think, and was a really solid guy. But you throw Marlon Humphrey in on the other side, and like I said, they kind of eased him in with his snap count growing each game and playing a larger role each game until Jimmy got hurt later in the year. And then he actually took over full-time opposite of Brandon Carr. And he actually played really well in that Pittsburgh game. If you go back and watch that game and watch the snaps where Antonio Brown was lined up against him, look, nobody has shut down Antonio Brown. I'm not saying that.
Right, of course.
But he played really well, as a first-year corner against him. And so I think that makes fans feel a little bit better about Jimmy's absence this year is because Marlon Humphrey is going to be perceived or maybe even in reality be the number one corner right now. And then, Brandon Carr, he obviously has some limitations in terms of speed. I mean, I think that's where you can see where he can be exposed is matching up with speed. But in terms of being physical, in terms of playing, sort of intermediate to underneath routes, I think he's still solid right there. But then you add in a guy like Tavon Young, a slot cornerback who they drafted a couple of years back out of Temple. Guy I really, really liked. Tore his ACL last year in training camp, so missed all of last season. So he's back this season. Looks healthy, looks good in the preseason. Just a feisty, scrappy, hard-nosed dude who likes to mix it up in the slot. Good in coverage, particularly man coverage. You can rush him off the slot. He's a slider-built guy, so you can probably attack him in the run game a little bit. If you can get him in nickel or get him in dime. You might be able to expose him a little bit there because he's not one of your bigger, slot cornerbacks. He's not like a 200-pound guy or anything like that. So there might be some opportunities there. But from a coverage standpoint, really solid there. Obviously, the safeties, people know about Weddle and Jefferson. Jefferson has issues last year. Jefferson definitely had his struggles last year in terms of man coverage against tight ends, was exposed for, I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6 touchdowns last year.
Yeah.
So, you
got to think too on the back end, those guys are aging and say what you will about defensive backs in general, but speed is a big thing for defensive backs. And when you lose a step, and other teams and other offensive coordinators know that, they scheme around that. And in this instance, Mike, I look at the Bills wide receivers, and let's be honest, they're not scaring any defensive coordinator. They're not keeping any defensive coordinator up at night. This isn't Antonio Brown, or in this case, even John Brown. Okay, they don't really have that speed level guy, but what they do have are some height mismatches. So let's, for instance, say the Bills come out in packages, because I fully expect this to happen, where Calvin Benjamin, who's ranging in at around 6'5", 6'6", Logan Thomas, same height, 6'5", 6'6", Andre Holmes, 6'4", 6'5". If the Bills are coming out in packages like that, what would you think that the Ravens would be? And are their base packages, in your opinion, are you comfortable with them going out there with a base package against that height, but not necessarily the athleticism that a package like that might bring for the Bills?
Yeah, I think it definitely offers some mismatch opportunities for the Bills. Just start with Benjamin. I think I mentioned to Aaron earlier that I just did a summer semester in the scouting academy, and one of the guys we had to evaluate was Kelvin Benjamin. And so I got to watch a bunch of games on him. And you're right. You can look at him and just the eyeball test, you can tell, okay, this guy's not going to be a speed guy. But what he can do is pretty much box out whoever he wants to box out in terms of a cornerback. You're not going to get around him. Right? If he wants to run a comeback, if he wants to run a curl, if it's a 50-50 ball kind of situation, he's probably going to win the majority of those situations just because of his sheer physical size. The guy's got great hands. I think he's got really underrated hands, in my opinion. So I think that definitely is going to offer some mismatch opportunities, because even though I like Marlon Humphrey, and I think he's on the cusp of becoming a really good young corner, that's going to be a big challenge for him. I don't think that we faced too many guys last year who have that physical profile. And you mentioned Andre Holmes, another tall guy. I don't think they faced too many guys who had that physical profile. And so I'm comfortable with the package. The Ravens actually, play a fair amount of dime. I think they'll play even more dime under their new defensive coordinator, Don Martindale, than they did under Dean Pease, even though Dean Pease played it more last year than he had ever before leading up to that. So I think you'll see a lot of dime from them. So I'm comfortable with the matchups, but I think that that's something that the Bills can exploit, because you're going to have just some physical height advantages up there that you can try to take advantage of.
Let's talk about this front seven now. And the defense you mentioned, it's got a new defensive coordinator. So you're definitely going to see, at least if you're a fan of the Ravens or someone that pays attention to them, maybe you're a Steelers or a fan of somebody in that division. What do you think about this and what I would consider a fairly aging front seven unit? And I think it starts and finishes with a guy and future first ballot Hall of Famer Terrell Suggs, right?
Suggs is amazing. The fact that he's still producing at the level, I believe this is like his 15th, 16th year, something like that, that he's still, he had 11 sacks last year. So the fact that this guy is still producing at that level with that many years in the league is really amazing. But when you look across the rest of that front seven, defensive tackles, Brandon Williams, Michael Pierce, relatively young guys.
Yeah,
right?
Big guys too. And Brandon Williams sticks out to me as one that I'm really sort of petrified about the idea of Vlad Ducasse having to go one-on-one with. But go ahead, scare me more.
So I think Suggs sticks out because he's got all of that time. When you look at the rest of them, they're actually relatively young. So we talked about those two guys. If you look at the outside linebackers and sort of the five technique defensive ends opposite Suggs, outside linebacker, they've just got a crew of guys out there, right? You got Matt Judon, who I think had 6 or 7 sacks last year, expecting big things from him. You've got Tyus Bowser, you've got Zadarius Smith, you've got Tim Williams out of Alabama, who, again, it was preseason, but I think he had at least according to Pro Football Focus, I think he had the most pressures of anybody in the preseason. I mean, he's just ripping the corner around people. And again, it's preseason, so we'll wait and see on that. But I actually think their front seven is relatively young, relatively youthful. But yeah, I think that the pressure that they're going to be able to generate this year, and hopefully, I'm not talking about pressure in terms of rushing 5 or 6 or 7. I mean, I'm sure they'll do some of that. But I think if they can get some pressure just kind of out of their base packages, and they kind of struggled with that last year, but I definitely think that all those guys I just mentioned have taken some steps forward. And, you know, if you can rush 4 and drop 7 and get pressure, I mean, obviously every defensive coordinator wants to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the AFC North in general, and I mean, maybe you look at this division and think the Steelers maybe have the weakest defensive line, and that's a defensive line that's got Stephon Tuitt and has some really nice players on it as well. Like, I look at the AFC North and I see them as like front 7 heaven right now, not only in the AFC but in the league. Where do you believe the Ravens front 7 maybe ranks in the AFC North and maybe across the league? You mentioned some of those young defenders, but that front 4, that defensive line, that the trenches of this defense really is maybe, and I think maybe Cincinnati is just as underrated because Geno Atkins still, to this day, I just don't know how, doesn't get the love that he deserves. And you just look at guys like that, and they're sort of riddled throughout the AFC North. So talk a little bit about maybe where they're going to rank this year amongst the AFC North and maybe the AFC in general.
Yeah, and I know I don't have to tell Bills fans about the Bengals.
No, you don't.
those guys are really impressive. They've got a really impressive line, impressive looking line this year. But the Ravens, I think that if those guys that I named can all kind of take that next step, you know, they're all younger guys. I think Judon is in his 2nd or 3rd year. Tim Williams is in his 2nd year. Bowser is in his 2nd year. Zadarius Smith's been around a little bit longer. I think this is his fourth year or so, maybe 5th year if they picked up his option. So it's just time for them to take that next step, right? I think if they can do that, then I think you can see them move up and maybe get into maybe that top 10, top 12 range in terms of defensive lines across the league. I think that they can get there. I think they have the potential to do that from a not just a run stopping percentage, perspective, because obviously Brandon Williams and Michael Pierce, I think, are among 2 of the best young D tackles in the league already. But I think from a pass rushing perspective, you could really see them take a jump there with those guys that I mentioned. So I think the opportunity is there to be really, really good. I think right now it's hard to say they're there yet. I'd probably put them a little bit more towards the middle of the pack in terms of pass rush. Run defense, I think they're already near the top of the league already. But in terms of pass rush, I'm kind of taking that wait and see approach.
Yeah, you're scaring a lot of people in the chat. I'm not going to lie to you, Mike. But what I want to, and somebody brought up a great point about maybe how the Bills can counteract some of the strengths of the Ravens. And do you believe, not just the Bills, but how offenses might try to attack the Ravens by going with some more empty set looks, trying to maybe spread that defense out horizontally and make more of an east-west, trying to attack north-south by moving them out east-west, if that makes sense to you?
It does. And I think that probably is one of the ways that you'll see not just the Bills, but other teams try to attack this defense. I think Eric actually talked about that in his scouting report that he put out today. He went back and looked at some games from the Patriots against the Bills when Brian Daboll was the tight ends coach with the Patriots. And when you look at if you look at their defense, the linebacker position, C.J. Mosley is a really good linebacker. I'm a big fan of C.J. Mosley, not trying to downplay him at all. But I think that's where you can maybe exploit some things. Not just CJ, but even I'm just the linebacker position in general. So Patrick Onwuasor is the guy that lines up opposite of CJ. And I think what you can do, like you said, with those empty sets is you can get a back out. Obviously, LaShawn McCoy is a very good receiving back. So you can get a guy like that out in space and get one of those linebackers matched up against him. And I think they really struggle to cover backs and athletic tight ends. And Charles Calais is a pretty athletic guy in man coverage. I think they try to play them in zone a lot. You'll see them if you've already watched them, you've already seen it. They pretty much zone drop to the middle of the field a lot of times, and you don't see them kind of man up against backs and tight ends a lot because I think they try to protect those guys. But if you can come out formationally and kind of create some of that, I think you can exploit some advantages there. And like I mentioned before, I think Tony Jefferson is, and I love Tony Jefferson. I think he's gonna really improve from where he was last year, because he mentioned some things recently this year saying that, he was playing coming off of a hernia surgery last year. So he played all last year coming off of that. Obviously it was his first year learning the defense, and he admitted that it was a lot more complex than the defense he played in Arizona. So it took him a little while to get it. So I fully expect him to improve, but I think that there could be some opportunities to line up, maybe Charles Clay against him in man coverage and try to exploit that a little bit. And even Weddle. I mean, Weddle, the reputation is there. And look, he had a great year. I think he had 6 or 7 interceptions last year. And as a secondary, they led the league in interceptions. So I'm not trying to take anything away from Eric Weddle, but he's not the man coverage guy that he used to be. He's great in the middle of the field. If you just want to kind of drop him back there and let him read and use his eyes and instincts to make plays, I think he's still very good at that. But if you can get him manned up, I think you can take advantage.
And what I look at too from the Bills standpoint is you mentioned LaShawn McCoy as being a great receiving back. I think there's a very good chance that LaShawn McCoy leads this Bills teams in receptions. I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100%, but I'm pretty sure he did last year. If he didn't, he was number 2. He was the number 2 receiver last year. He very well could have the most receptions at the end of this season this year, especially if Nathan Peterman is going to be in there a lot, because I think he really utilizes the middle of the field. He's going to utilize those running backs. Marcus Murphy, another name that you should familiarize yourself with, because I think he's going to be a big back out of the backfield in terms of passing downs, especially on third down. A guy that you're not really losing a ton from what we've seen in preseason from when Shady comes off the field and he comes on. So, yeah, I think that's really where you're going to see the Bills try to attack this Ravens defense. Before we get off, though, I wanted your thoughts, because this was a Twitter battle I was just having before we get on, about Le'Veon Bell. I mean, this is a guy that the Ravens fans have seen, twice a year for 5 years and are probably all very much about all this drama that's happening within the Steelers organization and Le'Veon Bell. They'd love nothing more to see him either out of the division or out of the conference in general. Your thoughts as a whole, how the NFL values the running back position, and maybe looking at a guy like Le'Veon Bell specifically, because I think it is so difficult to lump Le'Veon Bell in with a group of running backs, even the top backs. Ezekiel Elliott comes to mind. Like, you can't even really compare Le'Veon Bell and what he does to a guy like Ezekiel Elliott, because this is a player who 3 out of 5 seasons has had 75 or more catches, 2 seasons of which he had 80-plus catches. So this isn't a guy that is just, running for 1,500 yards and 15 to 16 touchdowns. This is a guy that is second on your team. And in most cases, 80 catches is your leading receiver, but they just happen to have a position as well.
Yeah, look, first I'll say, just before I get to the general thing about the valuing of running backs, Lev, get your money, man. Don't take anything less. You stay out for as long as you need to. If you need to miss the whole season, you do what you need to do, man. Because the Ravens,
you'd be fine with that, I bet. Because
the Ravens definitely do not want to see that dude. So if you need to sit out to get your money, you do it, man. Do what you need to do. But yeah, that's an interesting question, because specifically with him, it's almost like he's carved out his own sort of hybrid, like you said, there really isn't
close. I would say the closest guy that you're going to get to Le'Veon Bell is Todd Gurley. But even then, and this is one of my arguments about Bell too, Mike, is he has sort of changed the way that younger players at the position are attacking the position, meaning how their running style, how their his patience is something that, like, I've never seen before in running back. And I think he's sort of doing what Steph Curry has done in the NBA to add to the three-point game, is what Le'Veon Bell is doing to the running back game and the position at running back.
Yeah, you've heard some coaches talk about it. Like, that's not the way that you would coach it, right? To literally come to a stop once you take the handoff and then restart and, pick your lane or pick your gap at that point. But obviously he's talented enough to do it and has the physical ability and the mental ability. I think that's a part that maybe gets underrated a little bit, to be able to see that and to set up blocks in the way that he does is really a skill. And I think you're right. I think you see that it's shaping a new generation of running backs. Another guy who maybe is somewhat comparable, David Johnson, right? When David Johnson was healthy, another guy caught a ton of balls, played wide receiver for some point in college. Even Kareem Hunt, a little bit, not quite on that level, but, was a pretty productive receiver from the running back spot last year. So, you're starting to see this more hybrid guys always caught passes out of the backfield, right? But little flares, little swings, stuff like that. But now literally lining these guys up outside, and linebackers can't cover them.
Right.
Safeties can't cover them. You almost have to put a corner on the guy, but then you're disclosing a lot of information about your defense when you line up that way. So there's just so many tactical advantages to having guys like that. And even though I think if you look at the money, if you look at contracts and that kind of thing, aside from the very, very top guys, it looks like running backs, at least monetarily are being undervalued or being devalued a little bit. And maybe even in terms of draft capital too. When you look at where teams are drafting, they're not necessarily spending those real high draft picks. But I don't know. It's always been an interesting question for me because we used to talk about that here in Baltimore, like Ray Rice, where he's saying, whatever you feel about what he did, I don't want to get into that. Because I don't
strictly
agree.
Success on the field, right?
I certainly don't agree with any of his personal conduct. But whether we should have given him that second contract or not, right? Because then when the situation happened with him, ton of dead money was left behind that they had to eat, and so there was this discussion about, well, look, because people kind of fast forwarded and they said, well, if you can find a guy like Alex Collins, why would you turn around and pay these guys these huge second contracts? Well, look. Yeah. You're not always going to find a guy like Alex Collins.
That's right, and that's what I think sort of gets lost in all this. And a lot of people in the chat currently bringing up Connor. And what if Connor plays really well and they go 12-4? Does that diminish Le'Veon Bell's value? And I don't think that the success of the Steelers' offense diminishes or better creates more value for Le'Veon Bell. It's strictly in a vacuum. I look at Le'Veon Bell as what he brings to a team, what he brings to an offense, but more importantly, how teams have to physically game plan around a player like that opens things up for players like Antonio Brown. It opens things up for other players on that offense. And especially because I look at Big Ben and what his struggles have been on the road the last few years, and how much of that is tied to Le'Veon Bell's absence, and whether it's injury or suspension. And so there are so many great talking points, and maybe Le'Veon Bell is maybe the perfect talking point with running backs, because I just don't think you can lump him in as a running back because he adds so much in that other value. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's an overall interesting discussion to me, because I think we've seen a little bit of a parallel discussion with Khalil Mack, right? So people looked at the Raiders from a defensive standpoint and looked at them statistically and said, well, yeah, Khalil Mack was there, but they weren't that good in terms of their rankings or whatever. But then going back to your point, what value does having a guy like that bring tactically? What teams have to game plan for, the resources they have to dedicate to block that guy, right, that are being pulled from other parts of the offensive game plan. So you can, so similarly going back to Bell, you could look at it statistically and say, well, if Connor comes in and plays well and they still have a good season and get to the playoffs, and say, well, look, they didn't really lose much. They didn't have that much of a performance drop off, but there's more to it than just those counting stats, right?
Absolutely.
And coaches will think about it that way, because a coach will say, well, look, if I don't have to game plan for Lev Bell, and no disrespect to James Conner, he may turn out to be awesome, but if I don't have to game plan for Lev Bell, and you're telling me if I had to choose between game planning for him or James Conner, I'm going to take James Conner every day of the week.
All day, man. Hey, man, I really appreciate you taking on some time talking with us over at Cover One Buffalo. Tell the folks that are still listening, of course, where they can find your work, because there was some good words about you in the chat. People really appreciate your intellect, and you know your stuff about the Ravens. So where can folks follow you if they're looking for some Ravens information this year?
Well, I appreciate that. Thanks to all the people out there in the chat. Probably some relatives I paid to get in there and say some things. But you can find me at russellstreetreport.com. I do some work over there for them. You can find me at purplerain.com. And, of course, you can follow me on Twitter, again, at Abukari. That's Abukari. And, Nate, again, just thanks to you. Thanks to Eric, Aaron, all the team over there at Cover One. I really appreciate it.
Hey, man, no problem. I want to remind the folks that if you don't have Cover One, the app, you can go to the App Store, Android, Apple, all that good stuff. It's up on the App Store. Don't forget to follow us and get the newsletter up at cover1.net. Obviously, as I mentioned, always pumping out tons and tons and tons of content. They're adding more writers. They're adding more podcasters every day. The content is never stopping, and certainly now that we're going to be heading into the regular season, that quality content is going to be fast and furious. So make sure you join us. Mike, thanks a lot, man, for joining me. For me, Nate Geary, and for Aaron today, because he couldn't get a damn babysitter for his kid. We will be back next week. Don't you worry. So thanks for everyone that was tuning in for this episode of Cover One Buffalo.